"Stop playing." Those were the judge's cold words, cutting off a teenage girl mid-audition, dismissing her before she'd even begun. But when she sat back down and played a forbidden melody, his late wife's private composition, the room froze. The truth unraveled. What followed was more than music. It was healing. It was memory. It was legacy. This is the story of Lila Emerson, a shy foster girl who walked into a conservatory and shattered the silence with a song her grandmother never finished. What began as humiliation turned into a standing ovation that echoed for generations. Because sometimes, all it takes is one unheard voice to finish the music that the world forgot. Watch until the end, because the final note will change everything. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. I said, "Stop playing." The words cracked like a whip in the auditorium, sharp, cold, and final. Lila's hands froze just above the keys, the delicate echo of her opening notes still trembling in the air like a question left unanswered. A hush swept across the room, thick and suffocating, swallowing the breath of every spectator, every fellow auditionee watching from the wings. The sound didn't die. It shattered. And the silence that followed felt like judgment. The man who spoke was already leaning back in his chair, arms folded like a steel gate across his chest. Mr. Richard Hawthorne. Everyone knew him. The judge who never smiled, whose critiques sliced like razors. He was once a concert pianist of breathtaking renown, now a figure of solemn tradition and measured disdain. To be dismissed by him was to be dismissed by music itself. Lila looked up slowly, her chest rising with a breath she didn't dare release. The grand piano loomed in front of her, its polished black surface gleaming under the audition lights, but she no longer saw it. All she could see was his eyes, icy, narrowed, already bored. "You came in here trembling," he continued, his voice clipped, each word a brick in a wall he had built between himself and empathy. "Your posture is unsure, and your tempo, rushed. We have many more auditions to get through today. Thank you." He didn't look at her again. There was a soft rustle as one of the other judges shifted in their seat. A woman with kind eyes and a clipboard glanced at Lila and seemed to hesitate, but she said nothing. No one said anything. This was Hawthorne's room, and his word was final. Lila's heart pounded in her ears, louder than the piano had been. Her fingers hovered, frozen in time. For a moment she couldn't feel the ground beneath her. She stood slowly, her fingers trembling as they collected the loose sheet music on the bench beside her. Paper brushed against paper, with a sound that felt far too loud. Her legs wobbled. Her throat burned. But she didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of people who didn't believe in her. As she turned to leave, her eyes briefly swept over the empty rows of seats in the back of the hall. Places her grandmother once sat years ago, clapping softly during living room recitals. The old upright back home had broken pedals and chipped keys, but it held her memories, her dreams. Her late grandmother, Clara, had whispered to her more times than Lila could count, "One day, someone will hear you and remember." But today wasn't that day. Lila took a step down from the stage, then another, then she stopped. Something in her gut wouldn't let her go. Not like this. Not when she hadn't even gotten to the part that mattered. The piece she prepared wasn't about tempo or precision or posture. It wasn't even about impressing them. It was about remembering. It was about love. She turned back. There was a sharp intake of breath somewhere behind the judging panel. Lila walked, not rushed, but with quiet resolve, back to the bench. She didn't ask for permission, didn't seek approval. She sat down again. Mr. Hawthorne's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" But she didn't respond. Her fingers touched the keys like they were old friends. And then she began to play. Not the piece from her official audition folder, not the classical piece that met the Academy's requirements. This was something else, something sacred. The melody that spilled from the piano was soft, haunting, and full of breathless longing. It rose like smoke from a candle just snuffed out, trailing upward into a hush that swallowed the room. The notes curled into the rafters, gentle and aching. Delicate, familiar. Hawthorne's mouth parted slightly. Lila didn't falter. The room melted away. There was no auditorium, no judges, no fear. There was only the memory of a porch swing in late spring, her grandmother's hands guiding hers across brittle sheet music, the scent of jasmine in the air, and the low hum of morning folded into every note. The song spoke. It sang of a love that had once filled a room and a silence that remained after that love was gone. Each note was a confession, a prayer. Hawthorne's fingers, knotted together on the table before him, loosened slightly. He knew this melody. No one else seemed to react, but he did. His breath stilled in his chest. His spine, once rigid with years of rigid judgment, slackened like something old inside him had cracked open. It couldn't be. The melody, the turn in the left hand, the fluttering fall of the treble, was too specific, too intimate. It wasn't from any published collection. It was a private piece, composed by someone who had once laughed on a park bench beside him, her hair tucked behind one ear, pencil tapping lightly on blank bars of manuscript paper. "Clara?" he whispered. The name left him without permission, like it had been waiting all these years for a reason to breathe. Lila reached the middle section of the song, the part her grandmother always said was the soul of it. Her hands trembled now, not from nerves, but from something rawer, deeper. Each note felt like a goodbye and a welcome home at the same time. And then she paused, just for a beat, long enough for silence to wrap itself around the room again. She looked up, straight at the man who had tried to stop her. "My grandmother used to play this for me," she said softly, her voice just above a whisper. She called it Clara's Waltz. The name hit him like thunder in a still forest. Clara's Waltz. He had never heard it since she passed, never played it since the day he buried her. It had been her private composition, something she hummed while folding laundry, something she played at home but never shared with the world. A lullaby for moments that mattered. And here it was, not from a dusty recording or fading memory, but from the hands of a trembling girl with her eyes full of courage. He rose slowly. The other judges stared at him, confused, but said nothing. His eyes remained on Lila. Who taught you that?" he asked, his voice trembling for the first time in years. She held his gaze. "Clara Emerson. She was my grandmother." The silence that followed felt like the breath between heartbeats, fragile, infinite. She stood then, no longer shaking, no longer unsure. She said, "One day I might meet someone who needed to hear her music again." Mr. Hawthorne sat back down, but not out of dismissal. He sat as though the weight of everything he had buried had just risen to the surface. His fingers touched his lips. His eyes were red. It was no longer an audition. It was something else entirely. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Richard Hawthorne felt something stir in the hollowed part of his chest where grief had once lived. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sorrow. It was something dangerously close to healing. The room did not breathe. A stillness had settled over the space like snowfall, quiet, slow, almost sacred. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a phone buzzed and was immediately silenced. The other judges sat frozen, as though time had stopped precisely at the moment the girl said Clara's name. And Hawthorne, he hadn't moved since. His jaw twitched. His eyes, bloodshot now, stared at Lila with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something so tender it looked out of place on a face so often carved from stone. He blinked once, then again, but it didn't change what he was seeing. She was still standing there. She had not disappeared with the final chord of the song, nor faded like some cruel apparition conjured by grief. No, she was real. Her presence, solid and unwavering, reminded him of a spring morning long ago when Clara had stood in that exact same place on that exact same stage, playing a very different piece, though with the same fierce, raw love bursting from every note. "Clara Emerson," he repeated slowly, as if testing the shape of the name on his tongue for the first time in years. Lila gave a soft nod, the kind that carried weight, like a pebble that disturbs still water in ever-widening circles. "She was my mother's mother," she said. "She passed away last November." The words wrapped around him like a winter wind. He felt it, deep and sudden, a hollowing, not just of the lungs, but of the years. He remembered the last time he saw Clara, not in a hospital bed because he had never visited. That chance was stolen by regret and the kind of pain that makes cowards of good men. No, he remembered her last through the music, the fragments she'd left scattered around their once shared home, scribbled notes on torn pages, half-finished melodies in the piano bench, and her humming as she brewed tea. always humming. Always that same soft rhythm she called our waltz. And now it had come back to him not through memory, but through this girl. Through her granddaughter. Through her hands. He stood up slowly, the legs beneath him not quite ready for the weight of the moment. He didn't speak this time. He just walked down the judge's platform, across the open floor, and toward the grand piano where Lila still stood like a question mark drawn in flesh and light. She looked at him, uncertain. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her now, the bravery that had carried her back to the bench slowly dissolving in the heat of his stare. She didn't know what he would do. His silence had always felt like judgment. But now it was different. When he reached her, he didn't ask another question. He simply raised a trembling hand and pointed at the bench. Sit. The word was not sharp this time. It was soft, frayed at the edges. She sat hesitantly, not daring to look away from him, and then he turned to the audience of stunned judges and said, "This audition is no longer standard. I need a moment." He sat beside her. The wooden bench creaked beneath them. Lila looked over, startled, as he stretched out his fingers and placed them lightly on the keys, just above middle C. His hands were aged but not weak. They were hands that had once filled concert halls and stitched together symphonies from silence. She didn't move. She didn't know what to do. Then, he nodded. Just once, she understood. She began again, this time slower. Her touch was lighter now, not out of fear, but reverence. And when the melody reached its first familiar swell, his left hand joined hers, weaving gently beneath her right, like a memory being rewritten. Together they played. The duet was imperfect. His timing faltered once. Her breath caught at another measure, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way the music filled the room, not as performance, but as resurrection. Every note became a heartbeat. Every pause a held breath from the past. This wasn't about the audition anymore. It was about everything that had gone unsaid between him and Clara, and the strange way time offers forgiveness, not through words, but through echoes. They reached the final passage, her favorite, Clara used to say, because it resolved not with triumph, but with grace, a soft landing after a storm. And when the last note faded, Hawthorne didn't lift his hands. He just sat there, staring down at the ivory keys as if he were afraid they might vanish beneath his touch. Lila slowly pulled back. Her hands were sweating now, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He turned toward her, and for a moment he didn't see a student. He saw a link, a bridge between the life he had buried and the part of him that still wanted to feel it. "I never heard her play it that beautifully," he said, barely above a whisper. Lila's eyes widened. She said, "You helped her write it." His smile was fragile. "No," he said, "she wrote it for me. I just didn't deserve it." She looked down, unsure how to respond. But in that silence, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellowing paper, creases sharp from time, but preserved with care. He unfolded it with ceremony, the way one might handle an heirloom. "This," he said, offering it to her, "was her last, handwritten version. I've kept it in my pocket every day for 10 years. Lila stared at the paper. The staff lines were drawn in pencil, each note carefully curved with soft annotations in the margins written in looping cursive. "For R, always dancing even when the music stops." Her throat tightened. "She told me," Lila said softly, "that some music was never meant to be heard by crowds, only by hearts that remembered." He nodded. "She used to say that music was the only thing more patient than time." He laughed, and it broke, genuine and cracked like old porcelain. "Yes," he murmured. "She used to say a lot of things, most of which I was too proud to listen to." He looked at her again, and this time there was something more in his gaze, something almost fatherly, or perhaps something simply human. "You're not here for an audition," he said. "Not anymore. You're here to carry her." Lila's lips trembled. "I just wanted someone to hear her song again." He reached out, touched her shoulder lightly. "You didn't just play it, you brought it back." For a long while they sat there in silence, no words, no applause, just the soft echo of something that had changed, something that had healed. Behind them, the rest of the judging panel finally exhaled. One leaned forward and whispered to the others, "Did anyone know this girl's background?" "No," another murmured, "but it doesn't matter now." Because everyone understood, this wasn't an audition to be scored. It was a memory relived, a promise fulfilled, a love remembered. And somewhere, maybe beyond the reach of sound or time, Clara Emerson was smiling. The silence after the music felt like snowfall again. Thick, hushed, beautiful. But this time it wasn't the silence of judgment, it was reverence, the kind of pause that follows a miracle. No one moved, no one spoke. Then, softly, quietly, the judge to the far left of the panel stood. A gray-haired woman with ink-stained fingers and a scarf draped loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes shimmered. She had once taught composition at Juilliard, but in this moment, she was only a witness. She clapped. Once. Then again. Then the rest of the room rose to join her, one by one, a wave of quiet applause washing over the stage. But Lila didn't hear it. Not truly. Her ears were still full of that final chord, vibrating somewhere deep within her chest, like it had settled into the part of her that had missed her grandmother the most. She sat motionless on the bench, tears trembling in her lashes. Not the kind of tears that begged for sympathy, but the kind born from the weight of everything she hadn't said. The kind you shed when someone you loved was suddenly close again, through something as fragile and eternal as melody. Beside her, Mr. Hawthorne slowly stood. He didn't clap. His hands were too still, too careful, as if he feared they might betray him and show how much his soul was shaking. Instead, he looked at her. And in his silence was something larger than words. An apology, a thank you, and something else. Something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Grace. When he turned back toward the panel of judges, the room quieted. A half-second before he spoke, he glanced at the woman who had begun the applause. Their eyes met with mutual understanding. Both had known Clara. Both had known music before it became politics, before it became prestige. He cleared his throat. This audition, he began, his voice steadier now, was not conventional. It broke our process. It defied our rubrics. And thank God it did. The room listened. I've spent the last 10 years judging students like I was judging ghosts, searching for something that used to live in me, and I never found it because I wasn't looking in the right places. He gestured gently toward Lila. She didn't come in here to impress us. She didn't even come to compete. She came to remind us what music is supposed to be. Lila looked down, cheeks burning. She played a piece no one in this room had ever heard, he continued. A piece composed by a woman who changed my life. A piece that should never have disappeared. He looked at her again, and because of her, it didn't. He paused, drawing in a deep breath. I don't care what her GPA is. I don't care if she meets our theory prerequisites. I will sponsor her admission myself. A hush fell again, this one heavier. The woman at the end of the panel leaned forward. We've never accepted a student this way, she said. Not coldly, gently. Mr. Hawthorne didn't blink. Then let her be the first. There was a pause. Then the scarfed woman stood again, seconded. One by one, the judges around the table nodded. No voting, no hesitations. Just a shared understanding that sometimes the rules had to break to make room for the truth. The oldest member of the board leaned into the microphone and said, "Welcome to the Academy, Miss Emerson." Lila blinked. It didn't register right away. She was still stuck in that strange halfway world where emotions don't quite catch up with reality. Then she looked at Hawthorne. At his eyes, so unlike the legend she had heard about, so filled with something kinder, something fuller. And then her breath hitched, her lips parted. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening." He gave a slight nod. "Thank you, for playing." They both turned toward the judges, and then the audience beyond them, staff, students, musicians waiting their turn. Some stared. Others wept quietly. And somewhere among them, unseen but surely felt, Clara's spirit drifted like a lingering note. Unbroken, undimmed. As the room slowly emptied, Lila packed her sheet music in a worn folder. Her fingers paused on the last page, Clara's Waltz, handwritten in faded graphite, annotated in her grandmother's tiny careful scrawl. She'd carried it everywhere, but now it felt different. Lighter somehow, like the memory had been shared, set free. She didn't expect Mr. Hawthorne to still be there when she turned around, but he was. He held something in his hand, a box, simple, wooden, about the size of a jewelry case. He opened it slowly, and inside was a tarnished silver pendant, shaped like a quarter note on a delicate chain. Etched into the back was a date, June 12, 1978. Beneath that, "To my greatest listener." "She gave this to me," he said softly, "on the night she finished the song. I never wore it, I couldn't, but I think she meant it for someone like you." Lila reached out, stunned. I can't take this." "Yes," he said gently. "You can, and you should." He fastened it around her neck with a kind of trembling reverence, as if he were passing a baton not just in music, but in memory, in love, in legacy. She looked down at the charm resting above her heart. Her voice caught again. "Thank you." He stepped back, his smile almost imperceptible. "You don't have to thank me, just promise me one thing." She looked up. "Don't ever stop playing her song." And then, just like that, he walked away. Not like a man escaping a ghost, but like one finally free of one. Lila watched him go until the doors closed behind him. She turned back to the piano, touched the keys one last time that day. Then she whispered, almost to the silence itself, "I won't." The lights dimmed. The room emptied. But the melody, Clara's melody, lingered. Not just in the air, but in every person who had heard it, in every corner of the hall that had stood still to listen. And most of all, in the heart of a girl who had once feared she wasn't good enough, but found out that the truest songs are the ones that come from love. The first time Lila walked through the arched stone gates of the conservatory as an accepted student, it didn't feel real. The iron scrollwork above her head read, Belmont Academy of the Arts, but she still felt like an outsider, like someone who had slipped in through a crack in the foundation rather than marched through the front door. Morning light spilled across the cobbled courtyard, gilding the marble fountains and the manicured rose beds that lined the walkways. Around her, students with violin cases and leather-bound portfolios crossed the grounds with polished ease. Their laughter was light, their conversations filled with references to masterclasses, recitals, composers, and scholarships. Lila's steps were quieter. Her bag was worn, her shoes scuffed, and tucked inside her jacket pocket was the folded sheet music of Clara's Waltz and the tarnished silver pendant now nestled against her chest. She hadn't let go of either. It was only her second morning on campus, and she still hadn't met many of the other students. The first day had passed in a blur of orientation sessions, whispered stares, and professors who paused mid-roll call when they read her name aloud, Lila Emerson, as though trying to connect it to something unspoken. But she knew why they paused. They all knew the story by now. The girl who defied the judges. The girl who made the coldest man in the building weep. The girl who played Clara's waltz. She didn't mind the whispers. Not really. What she minded was the pressure that followed them, the unspoken expectation that she was something extraordinary. But she didn't feel extraordinary. She just missed her grandmother. That was all. The first class she stepped into was a theory seminar in a vaulted room lined with windows and old paintings. A young professor with round glasses and too many pens in his coat pocket greeted her kindly, but didn't call on her once. She was relieved. But by lunchtime it became harder to stay invisible. She had just settled on a bench beneath the old magnolia tree outside the west wing when she heard the click of heels. Two girls in neat navy uniforms walked past, whispering too loudly to be unintentional. "That's her," one said. "The Clara girl?" "No, the Judge Hawthorne girl." Lila pretended not to hear. She focused on the sandwich in her lap. But her hands tightened. She wasn't used to being noticed. And now that she wasn't sure if it felt like being seen or being hunted. Later that afternoon, her schedule told her to report to room 307, individual performance coaching. She hesitated at the door. Her hand hovered at the knob. She already knew who would be waiting. Inside, the room was warm, lit not by fluorescent strips but by sunlight through tall windows. And in the corner stood a single Steinway Grand, its black lacquer catching the light like a mirror. And beside it stood him, Richard Hawthorne. He wore a dark vest over his shirt today, his silver hair neatly combed, and a pair of glasses rested low on his nose as he read from a yellowing folder. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said simply. She did. The bench felt different now, not intimidating but sacred, like something shared between them. A space where words fell away and only music could explain the things that mattered. He turned to her after a long moment. His eyes were sharper than before, not cold but observant, curious. "I've selected 3 pieces for you," he said, handing her a bound collection. Debussy, Chopin, and one of Clara's unfinished manuscripts. Her breath caught. "She used to hum this one when she thought no one was listening," he added, almost absently. She never named it. I thought, maybe you could. Lila swallowed hard and took the pages. The last one was still in pencil, smudged, incomplete, but undeniably hers. Thank you, she whispered. He only nodded. Then, after a pause, play. And so she did. Her fingers stumbled at first. The Debussy piece was trickier than she'd practiced. A few missed notes, a brief hesitation, but she found her rhythm. Let the melody rise, let herself vanish into it. When she finished, Hawthorne didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window and looked out over the green quad. You have technique, he said at last. But your strength is storytelling. You make the piano confess. She looked up. But, he continued, your hesitation betrays you. You play like you're still asking permission. She flushed. I don't mean to. I know. That's why I'm telling you now. Stop apologizing. You've been accepted. Not just by the board or by me, by the music. His words echoed. You've been accepted. She blinked back, the sudden sting in her eyes. I don't know how to be here, she confessed. Everyone else, they belong. They come from places where this was always expected. I just came from my grandmother's living room. He turned to her. For the first time that day, something close to a smile touched the corner of his lips. So did Clara. That made her laugh, a soft, surprised sound that felt like sunshine after rain. She used to say the same thing about you. He raised an eyebrow. Oh? She said the world loved you before you learned how to love it back. For a second, the room grew still. Then he chuckled. That sounds exactly like her. The rest of the session passed in quiet instruction, small corrections, and careful praise. But as she left, he called after her. Miss Emerson. She paused in the doorway. Choose your name for the unfinished piece, he said, by next week. She nodded. That night, she sat by the dormitory window, watching the amber lights of the conservatory shimmer in the reflection of the lake. The sheet music rested on her lap, her fingers tracing the lines her grandmother had left behind. No title, no end. Just a melody, waiting for someone to understand it. She looked up at the stars, then down at the silver pendant at her neck. And she whispered to the night, we'll finish it together. The first time Lila played Clara's unfinished piece in front of anyone besides Hawthorne, her hands trembled, not from fear of failure, but from the weight of something unspoken resting beneath every measure. It was still rough, still learning its voice. Yet somehow, that made it feel more honest. Like a diary left open on a windowsill, waiting for rain. She performed it during a late afternoon practice session in Studio B, a glass-walled room where students often stopped to eavesdrop on one another. That day the sun hung low, draping gold across the piano's lid, as if the light itself had paused to listen. 3 students lingered outside, 2 violinists and a singer, and they didn't recognize the piece. That was the point. It wasn't something you could find in a textbook or on a playlist. It moved differently, like it was grieving and healing at the same time. One of them whispered, "Who wrote that?" Another replied, "She did. The girl who made Judge Hawthorne cry." Lila heard them, but she didn't turn around. She just played. And when she reached the end, the part that still had no real conclusion, she let her fingers hover over the keys for a moment too long. She still didn't know how it ended. Not really. But perhaps that was the secret. It wasn't supposed to end. It was supposed to linger. By the time she rose from the bench, the students were gone. She walked back to her dorm in silence. The campus had softened under dusk, the lights from each building glowing like stars trapped in glass. A few students crossed the lawn with cases tucked beneath their arms. Others laughed near the fountain. But Lila walked alone, as she often did, with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat and her thoughts curled like leaves in the corners of her mind. She passed Hawthorne's office on the way. A light flickered behind the frosted glass. She paused. Something about the glow made her feel comforted, not watched, but accompanied. As if someone else was up late, carrying the same grief she was trying to turn into music. Inside, Hawthorne sat at his desk, scribbling into a leather-bound journal. A small record player spun softly behind him, and for the first time in years it wasn't silence he surrounded himself with, but melody. One of Clara's old recordings. Her voice humming gently in the background like a ghost who had chosen to stay. He glanced toward the door, but didn't open it. He didn't need to. Some understandings don't require words. The next morning, Lila was called into the recital committee's office. She thought it was a mistake at first. She hadn't signed up for any competitions, and she certainly hadn't requested to perform. But when she arrived, she saw her name written on the schedule for the fall honors concert, in bold. She stared at it, stunned. "Is this?" "Approved by Judge Hawthorne himself," the secretary said with a knowing smile. "You'll be opening the concert. You'll play whatever piece you choose. Even," she lowered her voice, "an original work." Lila walked out with the confirmation letter crumpled slightly in her fist, unsure whether to run with excitement or collapse from the sudden gravity of it all. Heck, she didn't tell anyone, not even the girls in her dorm. Not yet. That night, she met Hawthorne for their usual Thursday lesson. He didn't wait for her to ask. "You'll open with Clara's piece," he said simply. "But it's not finished," she replied. "It still doesn't have an ending." "Then write one," he said. She stared at him, stunned. "I can't. I'm not her." "No," he said softly, "but you are her echo." There was something fierce in the way he said it, like a father protecting something sacred, like the music had become more than legacy, more than memory. It had become his redemption. He stood, walked over to the piano, and laid the sheet down across the stand. His fingers moved to the keys with slow precision, each chord played like a prayer. She always said the ending should feel like a goodbye that didn't hurt. Lila swallowed. "I don't know how to say goodbye." He turned to her, eyes glassy but clear. "Then don't. Say thank you instead." She went back to her dorm in the quietest hours of night, the moon pulling a soft silver over the rooftops. She sat by the window again, pulled out the old pencil, and stared at the unfinished bars. She didn't add complexity, she didn't add flair, she just added a note, then another. And with each measure, her hand steadied, her breath slowed. She wasn't trying to impress anymore, she was speaking. By morning, the piece was finished. She titled it, "For the Ones Who Still Listen." The day of the concert came with unexpected warmth for autumn. Clear skies, a breeze just strong enough to make the leaves dance in golden spirals across the campus green. The auditorium filled slowly, every seat occupied. Professors, students, alumni, even city musicians. The buzz of anticipation rippled through the velvet rows. Backstage, Lila stood in a pale blue dress, simple, elegant, borrowed from one of the older girls who had silently placed it on her bed that morning with a note, "You belong here. Play like it." Her hands shook as she waited. When her name was announced, the applause came like a wave. She stepped into the light. At center stage, the grand piano waited. She sat, adjusted the bench, and closed her eyes. For one moment, she didn't play. She listened. The hum of the crowd, the ache in her chest, and somewhere deep within, the echo of Clara's voice. "Let them remember who we were." She began to play. It was different this time, bolder. Not because she played louder, but because she played with her whole soul. Her fingers knew every rise and fall, every quiet yearning within the melody. And when she reached the final passage, the part she had written herself, there was no fear. She ended with a soft E major chord, open, gentle, and she let it linger, her hands hovering just above the keys, as if saying goodbye with one final touch. The hall was silent for a breath. Then, an eruption. Applause like thunder. Tears in every corner of the room. And in the front row, Richard Hawthorne stood. Not with critique, not with restraint, but with pride. Unshaken, undeniable. He clapped the longest. She rose slowly, bowed once, then stepped away from the piano. And as she walked off stage, pendant glinting against her collarbone, eyes still wet, one truth followed her like a whispered hymn. She hadn't just played her grandmother's song. She had finished it. The night after the concert, Lila couldn't sleep. The applause still echoed in her ears, not as noise but as something deeper, a soft heartbeat that refused to quiet. Her fingertips tingled with memory, as though the keys still lived beneath her skin. She lay on her back beneath the dim glow of her desk lamp, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. The sheet music of "For the Ones Who Still Listen" resting like a lullaby beside her pillow. Outside her dorm window, the campus had gone still. Only the faint rustle of wind moved through the trees, and somewhere, a late train rumbled through the distant hills, a low hum that came and went like a thought you couldn't quite hold on to. She pressed a hand over her pendant and whispered into the silence, "Did you hear it, Grandma?" There was no reply, of course. Only that gentle emptiness, that space where love once stood and still somehow remained. The next morning, she woke to find an envelope slipped beneath her door. Cream-colored, thick, no stamp, her name written in looping cursive. Lila Emerson. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, then opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. At the top, Belmont Conservatory Archives. Below that, typed in neat black letters, was a message. Dear Miss Emerson, please visit the archivist's office at your earliest convenience. A document belonging to your family has recently come to light during our historical cataloging process. We believe it was placed in storage over a decade ago by the late Clara Emerson. Sincerely, Marion Kerr, head of Conservatory Archives. Her breath caught. A document? From Clara? She dressed quickly, tugging on a sweater and boots, tying her curls back into a loose braid. She barely noticed the curious glances from students as she passed, or the way some stepped aside for her like she was someone worth watching now. Her steps were quiet but urgent, each one chasing a shadow of something she hadn't realized she was missing. The archives were tucked into the oldest wing of the conservatory, beneath a vaulted library that smelled of parchment and echoes. She found the door marked Archives and pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool, dry, and heavy with history. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, each labeled with names and years and composer initials. In the center of the room stood a round desk, and behind it, a woman with silver-streaked hair and half-moon glasses. Miss Emerson, the woman said warmly, standing to greet her. I've been expecting you. Lila nodded, heart thudding in her chest. You said there was something of my grandmother's? Yes. Marion Kerr turned and unlocked a small cabinet behind her. From it she withdrew a worn leather folder, tied shut with a faded green ribbon. This was discovered among a series of personal compositions donated by Professor Richard Hawthorne shortly after his wife's passing. We believe your grandmother placed it into his care before she left the faculty. Marion offered it with both hands. Lila took it slowly. Her fingers undid the ribbon like it was spun from memory. Inside the folder was a letter, folded crisply, yellowed with time. She lifted it with reverence. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clara's. She held it to her chest for a moment, inhaling the scent of aged paper and something sweeter, like lavender, faint and familiar. Then with trembling fingers she unfolded it. My dearest Lila, if you are reading this, it means the music found you after all. And if it found you, then so did I. You were always meant to carry more than sound. You carry stories, child. Feelings too big for words. That's what this family does. We play what we can't say. I left this letter in the place where I first learned to dream, hoping one day you'd come walking through the same doors. I always believed in you, even when you couldn't see what was coming. And I knew, deep down, there would come a moment when you'd sit at a piano and the world would stop to listen. When that day comes, promise me you'll remember. The music doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be true. And one more thing, if Richard ever hears you play, he'll remember who he is. And that's when you'll know you've done more than play. You've healed, with love that never ends. Grandma Clara. Lila didn't realize she was crying until the ink began to blur beneath her fingers. She clutched the letter like a lifeline and pressed it to her heart. Marion Kerr waited silently, respectfully. When Lila looked up, her voice was a whisper. Can I keep this? The archivist nodded gently. It belongs to you now. She walked back to her dorm like someone moving through a dream. The folder held against her chest, the letter folded carefully inside. Her heart felt swollen, stretched in the way only music and memory can stretch you, like love too big to fit inside your ribs. That afternoon, as sunlight broke through the clouds and scattered beams across the courtyard, she saw Hawthorne standing alone beneath the willow tree, a book under his arm, watching the fountain. She walked toward him without a word, holding the letter. When he saw it, his expression changed. Not surprise, something quieter. Recognition. She left one for you too, he said. Lila nodded, voice tight. She said, you'd remember who you were. He gave a soft, broken laugh. She always saw through the dark, even when I tried to live in it. They sat on the stone bench beside the water, the sound of the trickling fountain blending with the breeze. She believed you'd hear me, Lila said. I did, he whispered. The silence that followed was full, not empty, like a room newly furnished with forgiveness. After a while, he turned to her. She'd be proud of what you did with the ending. I didn't write it for her, Lila said softly. I wrote it with her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second letter. His own. Clara's final note to him. He handed it to her. I think, maybe it's time I shared this too. And as Lila unfolded it, the words blurred in her vision. Richard, if you're reading this, it means you're still breathing. And that means there's still music in you. Let it out. Let it live. And when you find the one who hears me, let her remind you how to listen. You were never cold, just afraid to be warm. Love her like you loved me. Guide her like we once guided each other. And when you hear the last note, don't close the piano. Open the window. She'll carry what we couldn't finish. Lila folded the letter slowly. Her hands shook, but not from sadness, from awe. They sat in silence after that. The letters between them, the past beside them, and the future waiting to be composed. Not every story ends with a grand finale. Some end with a whisper, some end with a song, and some, like Clara's, never end at all. The frost came quietly that winter. The stone paths of Belmont shimmered in the mornings as if dusted with powdered glass. The trees stood bare and beautiful, their branches stretched like fingers to the gray sky. The fountains froze over in delicate, crystalline ripples. And the music that spilled from the academy's windows grew slower, deeper, songs in minor keys, etudes shaped like memory. But inside the walls of the conservatory, Lila bloomed. Something had shifted after the fall honors concert, not just in how people looked at her, but in how she carried herself. She no longer walked like a girl afraid of the space she took up. She walked like a musician, like someone who knew where she belonged, not because she was told so, but because she had proved it in a language only the soul can hear. And yet, Lila never let the whispers define her. She still kept her head low in the hallways, still practiced late, long after others had left, still helped younger students struggling with finger placements or sheet music margins. She knew the difference between admiration and isolation, and she never let herself drift into the cold glow of pride. But the story of her performance, of the piece she completed, of the tearful judge who rose to his feet, had grown wings. People began showing up to her practice sessions, quietly sitting in the back of the room, listening. Some would stay long after she finished, not speaking, just watching her pack up her music like they were trying to understand how something so soft could cut so deep. One day, a first-year violinist approached her after class, holding his instrument like a shield. Do you think I could play with you sometime? Lila blinked. Your piece, he said. The one from the concert. I wrote a harmony for it. I hope that's okay. She smiled. That's more than okay, that's beautiful. And just like that, a duet was born. Then came others, a cellist, a flutist, a quiet singer who wanted to try setting the melody to words. It spread, one note at a time. Soon, Clara's unfinished song, now whole, was echoing through more than one room. Students began composing around it, choreographing to it, painting as it played. It became less of a piece and more of a seed. And Lila, without realizing, had become the root from which it all grew. Hawthorne watched it unfold with a kind of cautious awe. He'd begun to change in subtle ways, too. He started arriving to his lectures earlier, leaving the door to his office open. Sitting in the back rows of student concerts without announcing himself. His presence was still sharp. He would never be soft, but it was no longer cold, no longer withdrawn. There was a quiet warmth behind his eyes now, the kind that only comes from standing in the sun after years of shade. And every Thursday, without fail, he and Lila met for their private sessions. But they no longer felt like lessons, they felt like conversations. Wordless, musical conversations where the piano said everything neither of them knew how to say aloud. Sometimes he played first, sometimes she did. Sometimes they played together, creating pieces that vanished the moment they ended, like snowflakes melting on contact. One afternoon, as December turned the windows to ice, Hawthorne handed her a new composition, untitled, unpolished, barely legible. It's from Clara's sketchbook, he said gently. She never finished it. I couldn't touch it for years. Lila traced the faded staff lines with a fingertip. May I? He nodded. She played. And in that room, lit by the pale blue hush of winter, they brought to life a melody that had never been born. Clara's spirit lingered in every bar, but it was no longer bound to loss. This time, it felt like joy, like gratitude. The winter recital was scheduled for the week before Christmas, a tradition at Belmont meant to close the season with elegance and intimacy. Invitations were sent to alumni, patrons, professors, and families. The concert hall would be lit with candles and garlands, and each performance hand-selected. Lila had been asked to perform last. The final piece of the evening, she chose to premiere the duet she and Hawthorne had completed. It was both Clara's and their own, a hybrid of past and present. She didn't want to call it an ending. It was more of a bridge. They rehearsed in secret. Late nights, locked doors, quiet laughter between runs. It was Hawthorne who finally said what had hung between them for weeks. "She would have adored you." Lila smiled softly. "I hope she sees me." "She does," he said, "every time you play." The night of the recital arrived under falling snow. The conservatory was aglow, windows shimmering with warm light, the halls filled with the scent of pine and polish. Guests arrived in silk and wool, murmuring softly as ushers led them to their seats. The stage was bathed in gold. Candles flickered from every ledge, and at the piano a single stool waited. As the final intermission ended, the hall quieted. The director stepped on stage and cleared his throat. "Our final performance tonight is a special one. A tribute to legacy, to love, and to the music that lives on through those who dare to remember." Lila walked onto the stage, wearing a long velvet dress the color of dusk. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply took her seat, centered herself, and waited. And then, from stage right, Hawthorne emerged. There was an audible gasp. Many had assumed he'd retired from public performance. Some had never heard him play at all. He walked slowly, deliberately, carrying only a small folder and the weight of his own silence. He sat beside Lila, nodded once, and together they began. The music was unlike anything the audience had expected. It began in minor, slow, almost hesitant. Then it unfolded, rising, stretching, aching toward something it had long forgotten. Their hands moved with unspoken agreement, two voices blending into one. The piece shifted into major midway through, warm and full of breath like sunlight piercing through a fog. And the final bars? They didn't resolve. They drifted on purpose, because not every song needs to end. Some need to linger. As the final note faded, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was sacred. And then, applause. First polite, then fierce, then endless. They rose, bowed once, and stepped back. Lila looked out into the crowd and froze. In the third row among the rows of black coats and bright scarves sat a woman she didn't recognize. Mid-50s, dark curls streaked with gray, her hands clasped tightly at her heart. Eyes wet with tears, she mouthed one word, "Daughter." Lila's breath hitched. Hawthorne turned to her, and for once she didn't need music to speak. She ran down the steps and into the woman's arms. Because some reunions don't need explanation, just recognition. And some legacies don't end in grief. They begin again in song. The embrace didn't break easily. There was no need for words in that moment, not when music had done all the speaking. Lila held on tightly, her fingers curled into the soft wool of the woman's coat, the scent of lavender and old winters washing over her in waves. And the woman, her mother, clung just as fiercely, trembling with a grief that wasn't sharp anymore, but softened by time and the miracle that stood before her. They stayed there, in the aisle, as people filed out around them. Some glanced, some smiled quietly, a few wiped their eyes, but no one interrupted, not even Hawthorne. He remained by the piano, watching with a stillness that said he understood the sacredness of what was unfolding. When Lila finally stepped back, her mother cupped her face gently. Her voice was low, rough with emotion. "You look just like her." Lila's voice cracked as she whispered, "I tried to keep her music alive." Her mother smiled through tears. "You didn't just keep it alive, you gave it wings." They sat in the quiet auditorium long after it emptied, the candles still flickering like patient witnesses. Lila listened as her mother told stories she'd never shared before, of how Clara used to sing lullabies she made up on the spot, how she always hummed while baking, how every season had a soundtrack in their home. She told her about the day Clara got her acceptance letter from Belmont, how she cried not from joy, but from disbelief that someone like her, raised in a two-room house with no piano of her own, could belong somewhere so grand. She carried that feeling her whole life, her mother said softly. That quiet awe, And she passed it down, you know. Lila nodded. She knew. She'd felt it in every note she played. Her mother hesitated then, her gaze falling to the floor. I should have come sooner. You came when I needed you most, Lila said. You came when the music was ready. And somehow, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with snow and healing. They spent hours together, walking the frozen paths of Belmont, wrapped in scarves and stories. Her mother stayed in the guest cottage behind the faculty building, where Clara had once lived when she taught part-time after Lila was born. The cottage had been untouched for years, but now it felt like a home reborn. One evening, Hawthorne joined them. They sat by the fire, Lila curled on the floor with her mother, brushing out her hair like she used to when Lila was small. The old man sat in the armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, his eyes on the flames. She told me once, he said, that music can carry things words can't. Her mother looked up. She told me the same thing. Lila smiled. I think she told all of us. It was Hawthorne who broke the silence after that. I'll be retiring at the end of the spring term. The words fell like a sudden gust, unexpected and sharp. Lila sat up. Why? He looked at her gently. Because I found what I was waiting for. She didn't speak right away. He continued. For years I stayed because I couldn't bear to let go. But now I see what comes next, and I trust it. You can't just leave, she said quietly. I'm not leaving, he corrected. I'm stepping aside, he smiled. Not sadly, not reluctantly, but with peace. You'll play on, you'll teach someday. And he looked at Lila's mother, you'll keep telling the stories. That's all I ever wanted. Before he left that night, he handed Lila a worn journal, the kind with frayed corners and pages warped from time. It's hers, he said simply. She wrote in it during her last year. Lila held it as if it might vanish in her hands. The cover was cracked. Inside, Clara's voice lived again. Passages about melodies she dreamed in her sleep. Snippets of lyrics. Lists of names she'd never used for compositions. A drawing of a snow-covered bell tower. And at the very end, a single sentence scrawled across the bottom of the last page. One day, she'll sit where I sat, and she'll understand everything I couldn't say aloud. Lila closed the book, her heart aching in the most beautiful way. The final weeks of winter melted into early spring. Snow softened. Buds appeared on trees like shy promises. Students rehearsed with windows open. And Lila kept playing. She played for the first years who struggled with doubt. She played for professors who wanted to remember what joy felt like. She played in the garden behind the library, where Clara used to compose in a folding chair beneath the cherry blossoms. And then, one quiet evening, she walked alone to the recital hall and found the door ajar. Inside, Hawthorne was already there. He wore a dark suit, simple and elegant, his hair brushed back with care. A single chair sat at the center of the stage. No fanfare, no programs, no audience, just him and her. You knew I'd come, she said softly. He smiled. I hoped. She sat in the front row. He took his place at the piano, and for the first time in decades, Richard Hawthorne played a piece of his own. It was wordless confession. It was apology. It was gratitude. It was the sound of a heart that had been locked away and was now at last free. When he finished, he stood, bowed once, to her, not to the room, and walked off stage. She rose as he passed and whispered, I'll keep it safe. He paused. I know. She never saw him again on campus after that. But his music remained. In every corridor, every whisper, every student who now sat a little taller at the piano because someone believed they could. And as spring burst into full bloom, Lila stood at the front of her first masterclass, sheet music in one hand, her grandmother's journal in the other. She looked out at the nervous faces, young and uncertain. And she said, music doesn't start when you play a note. It starts when you remember why you're playing at all. Then she smiled. Let's begin. The years passed not as a blur, but like a song, each season its own movement, each memory a note that lingered long after the moment ended. Belmont changed as all places do. New faces arrived, old ones faded, but the music never stopped. And Lila, once the shy girl who trembled in front of a judge's cold stare, became a quiet pillar in the Academy's legacy. She never left. She graduated with honors, performed in cities she once only read about, Vienna, Chicago, São Paulo, but always returned to the red-bricked paths and ivy-wrapped windows of the conservatory. She became not just an alumna, but a mentor, a guide, a keeper of something sacred that couldn't be taught in books or theory. She carried Clara's melody like a second heartbeat. The students came to her, not just for technical corrections, but for courage. Some called her Professor Emerson, others simply Miss Lila, but all of them knew the story. The girl who finished the unfinished song, the girl who brought the stone-hearted judge back to life, the girl who taught them that it was okay to feel too much. In her modest office, the leather-bound journal sat displayed beneath glass. Clara's letters, music, and handwritten fragments kept safe like scripture. She never claimed it was a museum piece. It wasn't. It was a promise. She told every student who touched the keys in her class, "This music belongs to all of us now. Don't play it like a monument, play it like a memory." She composed two pieces inspired by nature, by grief, by rebirth, but none were more performed than For the Ones Who Still Listen. It traveled far beyond what she ever imagined, across colleges, conservatories, into chamber halls and high school competitions. Sometimes she'd receive videos in her inbox, children in small-town recital halls playing the melody with trembling fingers and enormous hearts. It spread because it was honest, and honesty endures. It was 4 years after that winter recital when the invitation came. A pale blue envelope, tucked neatly between faculty memos, no name on the front, just the emblem of the American National Symphony pressed into the corner. Inside, a letter in elegant serif type. "Dear Miss Emerson, we are honored to invite you to attend a special spring performance at the Kennedy Hall in Washington, D.C., where your composition, For the Ones Who Still Listen, will be featured as the closing piece of our Centennial Gala. This performance will also mark the debut of the Clara Emerson Tribute Series, an initiative to honor women composers whose voices shape the unshaped. We hope you will consider joining us on this historic occasion. With respect and admiration, Margot Liu, Artistic Director." Lila stared at the letter for a long time, not because she didn't understand it, but because she felt something rise inside her she hadn't felt in years, a soft ache. Joy, sadness, gratitude, all braided into one. Clara's name, her name, together. She went. Of course she did, out of pride but out of reverence. Washington welcomed her with magnolia trees in full bloom and skies brushed in soft gray. She arrived at the Grand Concert Hall wearing a simple gown the color of pearl, her hair pinned back with the silver note pendant that had once belonged to Clara. Inside, the auditorium glowed like a cathedral. Marble columns, velvet seats, rows of musicians tuning instruments with careful precision, and in the program, printed beneath the final piece of the night, For the Ones Who Still Listen, by Lila Emerson, inspired by the unfinished work of Clara Emerson. She sat beside the conductor backstage as they prepared. He was tall, gentle-eyed, his hands calloused from decades of guiding orchestras. He looked at her as the final movement ended and smiled. "I've waited 10 years to conduct this piece," he said, "ever since I heard a student play it in an empty college studio on YouTube." Lila blinked. "You found it that way?" He nodded. "It haunted me, and I'm not ashamed to say it changed me." She could only whisper, "Thank you." As the musicians began the piece, her fingers moved along with the melody from her seat. She didn't need sheet music anymore. Every bar lived in her blood. The audience was silent, reverent, and when the orchestra reached the passage she had written as the final phrase, a delicate E major chord fading into silence, there were no cheers. Not right away. There was only breathlessness. Then a single clap, then many. The hall erupted. But Lila didn't stand. She sat still, head bowed, because some music doesn't need applause to be whole. It just needs to be heard. After the performance, as she stood in the grand foyer lined with portraits of composers and patrons, a young woman approached her, no older than Lila had been when she walked into Belmont that first time. She held a small envelope in her hand. "Are you Lila Emerson?" Lila nodded. The girl passed her the envelope. "Someone asked me to give you this. Said it was important." "No name. Just handwriting." She opened it. Inside was a letter on parchment that had yellowed with time. Her breath caught. It wasn't from Clara, it was from Hawthorne. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Lila, if you're reading this, it means the music has taken you where it always promised to go. I knew it would. I just didn't know when. I never said goodbye. That was on purpose. I didn't believe in them. But if you're hearing this now, let me say instead, I believe in you. I saw in you what I lost in myself. And because of you, I remembered who I was. That is a gift I can never repay. But maybe I don't have to. Maybe this was the repayment all along. Thank you for listening, for hearing her, for finishing the song, and for starting your own. Yours in all things music, Richard Hawthorne. She clutched the letter to her chest, and for the first time in a long time she wept. Not from loss, not from pain, but from the unbearable beauty of being heard. That night, she walked alone beneath the Washington sky, the city glowing softly around her. She found a park bench near the Lincoln Memorial, sat beneath a street lamp, and pulled out her journal. She began to write. A new piece. No title yet, no plan, just feeling, just truth. Because sometimes the most powerful songs begin not with a key signature or tempo, but with silence. And a soul finally ready to speak. The years that followed did not rush. They arrived like waves, gentle but relentless, shaping Lila's life not with grand events, but with subtle, beautiful moments, quiet victories that built upon each other like notes in a song only she could hear. Her music continued to grow, across continents now. Conservatories in Europe and Asia taught her compositions as part of their standard repertoire. For the ones who still listen, was performed at weddings, funerals, graduations, and memorials. People wrote her letters from all over the world. A mother in Barcelona who played the melody to help her autistic son sleep. A violinist in Kyoto who claimed the harmony helped him find peace after his father's passing. But she never stopped teaching. Every fall, she stood in front of a new group of students at Belmont, her voice steady and soft, her heart open. She taught theory, sure, but more than that, she taught listening, how to hear the music underneath the notes, how to trust the silence between chords, how to find your voice when the world tells you to stay quiet. And though she was never loud, her influence was thunderous. One crisp October morning, years after that first trembling audition, Lila stood alone in the music hall, preparing for the annual Founders Concert. Her students had selected a theme this year, Echoes of the Unfinished. It made her smile. She sat at the Steinway, near the center of the room, the same one from her very first audition, polished now to a deep, golden gleam. The afternoon light spilled through the windows like honey, catching dust motes in midair. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and she began to play, not to rehearse, not for an audience, but simply because she needed to. It was the unfinished melody Clara had sketched all those years ago, the one she and Hawthorne had once completed together. She let it unfold, let it breathe. Each note felt like home. As the final chord faded into silence, a soft knock sounded at the back of the hall. She turned. A young woman stepped forward, barely 20, tall and wide-eyed, holding a worn music case against her chest. She looked nervous, awestruck. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Lila stood smiling. "You're not interrupting? Are you one of the new students?" The girl nodded, then hesitated. "I just wanted to say, I came here because of you." Lila blinked. "Because of me?" The girl stepped closer. "My grandmother used to play me your recordings. She told me about your story, about how you played your grandmother's song and made the world stop." Lila's smile softened. "She told me that sometimes," the girl continued, "we inherit more than blood. We inherit unfinished dreams, and that if we're lucky, we get the chance to finish them." Lila swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "What's your name?" "Clara," the girl said. Lila's breath caught. "Clara Thompson," she added. "My grandmother was named after a composer she loved." Lila's knees almost gave, but she steadied herself. "Well, Clara," she said softly, "would you like to play?" The girl's eyes lit up. I'd be honored." Lila stepped aside. The young woman sat, opened her case, and pulled out a flute. She raised it slowly, waited for breath to fill her chest, and then played the first few notes of For the Ones Who Still Listen. Lila did not cry. She just listened. And in that moment, she understood something so profoundly it almost undid her. Legacy isn't built in standing ovations or polished reviews. It's built in the breath between teacher and student, in the silent exchange of wonder, in a name passed down like a seed, finally finding soil. She watched the girl, so full of life, so full of hope, and she thought of Hawthorne, of the way his hand had once trembled as it hovered above the keys. She thought of Clara, singing lullabies with unfinished endings. She thought of the letter, long tucked into her desk, where Clara had written, "She'll understand everything I couldn't say aloud." And Lila understood now, not just the music, but the silence. The concert that evening shimmered with emotion. The hall was full, families, faculty, alumni from decades past. But for Lila, one seat remained empty in the front row. She had requested it. A single rose sat on the chair's cushion, and no one dared move it. When Clara Thompson stood to perform, playing the same melody Lila once had with trembling hands, the audience held its breath. Her version was not exact. She changed the phrasing, took the tempo slightly slower, added a trill in the second verse. But that was the point. It wasn't imitation, it was continuation. And when she finished, the audience rose as one. Not just for her, but for every echo that brought her to that stage. Lila stepped forward, took her hand, and whispered into her ear, "She hears you." After the performance, while others celebrated in the reception hall, Lila walked alone through the campus grounds. The night was cool, stars glittering across the sky like forgotten songs. She made her way to the old cottage behind the faculty building, the one Clara once lived in, then her mother, then, briefly, herself. She paused at the door, unlocked it, stepped inside. The cottage smelled of time and wood smoke. The same dusty piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed but unbroken. She sat. No audience now, no lights, just her. She opened the lid, ran her fingers across the keys, and then she played a new melody. One she hadn't written yet. One that came from someplace deeper than memory. A song for the quiet in between, for the spaces left by those we've loved, for the students still to come, for every unfinished song the world still carried. As the final notes dissolved into the night, Lila whispered the same words Clara had once written, for the ones who still listen. And far above her, among the stars and stillness, the music remained, always. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted from stages, but the ones whispered through music, memory, and silence. Lila's journey reminds us that greatness doesn't come from perfection, it comes from truth, from listening when no one else does, from finishing what others left behind, not for applause, but for love. Clara's unfinished song wasn't just about melody, it was about legacy. And through Lila, we see that every note we carry, every scar we heal, and every dream we inherit holds the power to transform not just ourselves, but generations to come. You don't have to be famous to matter. You just have to be brave enough to play your own music, even when it trembles. Especially when it trembles. So when the world tells you to stay quiet, when the judges dismiss your voice, when the path feels too broken to continue, remember this. Your silence is not emptiness, it's potential. And someone, somewhere, is still listening. Keep playing, because what you create may one day become the song someone else needs to survive.